You know, one of our nation's best investigative reporters when it comes to the issues of election integrity, and on others as well, but in particular this issue, is Brad Friedman. He's the founder and editor of the Brad blog. BradBlog.com is the website, and a guy for whom I have tremendous respect and admiration. Brad, welcome back to our program.
You're very kind, Tom. Thanks. Great to be here.
Great to have you with us, my friend. Virginia, it might be going after... Now, first of all, even before we get into this, there is a difference between election fraud and voter fraud. Would you please give that 30 seconds or so?
Sure. Well, in the case of voter fraud, we're generally talking about voters who commit fraud. In other words, voters who may vote twice or vote in the name of dead people and so forth. Election fraud...
Now, if I may just pause you, and that is about as common as what? And how often does that happen?
Hen's teeth.
Yeah, I mean, more people die by lightning strikes than commit voter fraud. If my recollection is right, it's on the order of like fewer than a dozen a year. People,
you're right. It's incredibly rare, but it's even rarer at the polling place, and that is, with these Republicans trying to push for these photo ID restrictions around the country.
Right.
Those restrictions would only refer to the polling place itself.
Right. So voter fraud would be more likely to be done by people who are mailing in ballots or doing absentee ballots. Okay. So election fraud. Election fraud is what?
Election fraud is a bit broader. It encompasses voter fraud. Voter fraud is a form of election fraud, but election fraud itself would generally refer to insiders who are gaming the system, whether it's election administrators, other party officials and so forth, whether they're stuffing the ballot box from the inside or whether they're using a few keystrokes to change the results of an entire election on our now completely computerized election results tabulators around the country.
Okay, so to bring this...
a much graver threat.
Absolutely, and that is a much more widespread practice, too, and has been arguably at least since the Civil War and probably since the founding of the Republic. But, with when African Americans were given the right to vote, the immediate backlash in the South was to figure out ways to disenfranchise black voters, whether it was, poll taxes or literacy tests or simply taking their votes and throwing them away, or physically preventing them from voting. So now the state of Virginia, according to your reporting, looks like they may be going after Newt Gingrich or his campaign.
Well, indeed, they are investigating the fraud that, incredibly enough, Newt Gingrich actually admitted to himself. It's on videotape. He says it to. It was shown on CNN. He's speaking to a supporter up in Iowa a few weeks back and explaining why he could not get on to the Virginia primary ballot, which requires 10,000 signatures. Mind you, that is Newt's home state of Virginia, and he failed to qualify. He explained the reason for failing to qualify to the supporter. He called it, quote, just a mistake. He said we needed 11,100, or no, we turned in 11,100 signatures. We only needed 10,000. However, 1,500 of them were fraudulent, turned in, he says, by, quote, just one guy. So one guy working for the Gingrich campaign, according to Newt Gingrich, created 1,500 fraudulent signatures in a failed attempt to get Newt Gingrich on the Virginia primary ballot by Newt Gingrich's own admission. So this is something that I've talked to the Virginia State Board of Elections. They have, in fact, confirmed that if this is true, it would be an illegal act, and that they referred the matter to the state AG's office, Ken Cuccinelli's office. I spoke with them, and they confirmed that, indeed, an investigation into this matter is currently underway in Virginia.
Fascinating. Now, to the larger issue of the state of our elections, just a couple of kind of calibration questions, Brad. You follow this stuff really closely, and it's been a few years since I've had the time to, frankly. How many European nations or other fully developed nations around the world are using electronic voting machines like we do?
Sadly, more and more. I mean, they're really pushing these electronic systems, particularly the 100% unverifiable type of touchscreen voting systems, in some of the largest democracies like India, Venezuela, and so forth. On the other hand, meanwhile, back in Europe, for example, in Germany, the High Court in Germany looked at it and said, no, those type of voting systems constitute secret vote counting. Our Constitution doesn't allow it. So those countries, most of those countries are still voting on paper, and many of them still appropriately, as we should be doing, actually counting their ballots publicly by hand in front of the public so that there will be very few questions about the results.
Right.
That's what we ought to do in this country. In fact, that's what we did, as you recall, back in the Iowa Republican caucuses up there. They counted all of the paper ballots by hand in front of everyone. You had this incredibly close race in the end, and there is almost nobody questioning the results, because in the end, they know that all of those ballots were counted publicly, and if there is any funny business with the numbers, there are hundreds, if not thousands of people who can step forward to say, no, I was there, I saw the counting, here's my iPhone photograph of the results that night. Counting that way in public at the precinct, it makes it very difficult to game an election.
Yeah.
That's what we ought to be doing, and that's what a lot of the European countries are still doing.
And Canada?
Canada is still doing that. Yep,
they're still voting on paper.
The country.
Okay. So, and finally, who owns the electronic voting machine companies in the United States, and who's tabulating? You know, I've read stories about one state's vote being tabulated in another state. You know, one company's vote. You know, I've heard that the Venezuelans own some of these machines that. Yep. You know, and which should make Republicans' hair curl. I mean, what's the status of all this stuff that started with way back in the day with Chuck Hagel and whatnot?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, when you say who owns all these machines, I was going to say, well, you got me. I mean, the fact of the matter is, these companies have been bought and sold and traded and merged so many times. And you're right, one of the largest companies, Sequoia Voting Systems, was actually owned by a Venezuelan company tied to Hugo Chavez. That company has now been sold off to a Canadian firm by the name of Dominion Voting, although Dominion and ES&S, the world's largest voting machine company, actually share what had once been the Diebold election system company. You referred to ES&S and Chuck Hagel. In fact, Chuck Hagel of Nebraska, senator from Nebraska, Republican, was in fact the principal owner of ES&S for some time before he ran for the Senate. And miraculously, for the first time in some 20 years, that seat went to a Republican after Nebraska had switched all of their machines over to ES&S.
Right. In fact, the Washington Post called that the upset victory of the year because Chuck Hagel, this white Republican, even won the African-American districts in the big city.
Exactly right. And,
how did that happen? That's amazing.
I dare you to prove that he didn't.
Yeah. Well, and that's the problem, of course, is there's no way to prove it. So right now we are voting on electronic voting machines that keep no record, and we don't know who owns the machines. And the tabulation is, what about this stuff of the tabulation? I actually asked the former what's his name from Ohio. I said, weren't your votes counted in Tennessee or something? He said no. Yeah.
Well, they were and they weren't. The problem is there's both the tabulation system and then there's the reporting system. So they may count them in one place, but then they may send them out of state to be put on the web and reported publicly. And during that period, between the time they're counted and the time they're actually posted, anything can and has happened to those results. And that's exactly what happened in Ohio. Could happen in Florida today, by the way. They're voting on paper ballots, but it is actually illegal in the state of Florida to count a paper ballot by hand, believe it or not.
Amazing. Brad Friedman, bradblog.com. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Tom.